I've given a title today to my presentation which is indeed inspired by Hans Westland's work on a post-urban world. I'm thinking about the post, what comes after this period of rapid urbanization and global urbanization. And I want to talk about cities after equality in this respect. Problems of equality and inequality in the growing, the declining, the stagnating, and the just stabilizing cities of our increasingly urban world. Much of the thesis that Westland develops in his work on the post-urban world is concerned with these exemplary megacities, cities of 10 million and above, more and more of which are being added to the urban slate over time. Here are some projections by UN Habitat. This always needs to come with a health warning, of course. Population science is an incredibly inexact science, but these are the UN's at least best guesses for the decade to come. A really pronounced increase in the number of cities across the world that will support populations in excess of 10 million. Tokyo retains its place at the top of the urban league table and is not expected to grow very much at all. In fact, it's not growing. But otherwise, of course, you note from this rather simplified table the kinds of trends that Edward Glaeser has talked about and with which we're also familiar. The intensification of urbanization in low-income economies around the world, in particular in South and East Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the population of megacities is only a small proportion of the urban population of the world. Of the 54% or so of people who live in cities around the world, most of them live in cities like Stockholm, not cities like Shanghai. So of course we need to be guarded in our thinking about megacities, and perhaps it should occupy less of our urban imaginations, urban metaphors, and urban panics than they currently do. But megacities are interesting because they concentrate urban trends, urban problems, and indeed urban anxieties that are visible elsewhere. My concern today, though, is less with the sheer size of cities. It is concerned with the growth of cities, but it's concerned with a process that seems to go along with urbanization in too many contexts today. That is the deepening of urban inequalities as urban population sizes increase. And in picking up on the theme of inequality, I'm picking up on one of the key themes that's run through Edward Glaeser's work over many years, along with his other urban concerns. And I wanted just to reflect for a moment on my relationship to Glaeser as a long-term reader of his. And I enjoy reading Glaeser's work because I think he kind of feels similar about cities as I do. He's clearly an urban optimist. He's an urban advocate, but he's very much alive to the inefficiencies, the inequities, and the incivilities that distort and disfigure too many of our cities today. And it's a real pleasure to be able to take part in this occasion in his honor, and of course to meet a writer who I've admired for some time and to find that he's just as engaging in life as he is on the page. I can assure you that can be quite a rare phenomenon amongst, beware meeting one's literary heroes, I should say. So this second slide looks at a range of urban Gini coefficients, the standard measure of income inequalities, usually across national populations. Here we have some best guesstimates for various urban populations around the world, some megacities, some not so megacities. The story of African urbanization, and we tend to think about that discourse in terms of sub-Saharan Africa and these rapidly growing cities that are adding population, that are consolidating around their peripheries. But of course, the most extreme patterns of urban inequality we find in urban Africa are in post-apartheid and post-conflict settings. So Johannesburg maxes out on this table as one of the most unequal cities in the world in income terms. It's only around 4 million, it's not a mega city, but it has mega inequalities inside its boundaries. Otherwise, in these variously large cities, variously rich cities, variously poor and middle income cities, you see levels of inequality that don't really distinguish between high income and low-income settings, such that the largest cities in the richest economy in the world, the USA, New York and Los Angeles, have levels of inequality which are commensurate with those in cities that lack the economic robustness and resilience, that lack the government capacity, that lack the urban infrastructures that these rich world cities enjoy. You'll notice that Tokyo has disappeared from this picture. And probably one of the things we should be doing more as urbanists is to learn more from the world's largest city, which doesn't show up in these kinds of mappings of intense urban inequality. I've added London slightly gratuitously, partly because apart from Moscow, it is one of the few European cities that shows really extreme levels of income inequality, sort of globally comparative levels of income inequality. It is predicted that even London will be a megacity by the middle of this century. London's population is slated to reach 10 million by 2050. By that time, presumably 10 million will be pretty small beer, and we'll have a new category for thinking about very large cities. I want you to notice also a couple of these cities at the end. Shenzhen, one of the new growth centers in China, but also San Francisco, a very wealthy city, a city that perhaps enjoys high levels of happiness, I suspect, higher than New York at least, but that also does fairly badly in inequality terms. And I want to come back to this in relation to Ed Glaser's work. Perhaps I'm doing something of an Ed Glaser on a bad day. You know, cities are good for us, but they're not so good for everybody in the same way. The reason why I'm interested in bringing inequality more centrally into this picture today is because the same factors that are driving urban growth in both economic and population terms are also deepening inequalities in many urban contexts. It is a simple fact of urban life that the dynamic trends which are driving urban economies will also produce inequalities. Most urban economies are organized around markets, and increasingly so, and markets produce unequal outcomes. It's one of the things that markets do. It's therefore one of the things that cities do. But the kinds of trends in urban economic growth that we're seeing currently, and I'll say more about this in a moment, are producing inequalities in somewhat new ways, or distinctive ways, in a range of different contexts. The other key factor, of course, to note is the impact of migration on producing and intensifying urban inequalities. So if we take, Ed Glaser was talking about the Brazilian, Chinese, US, and Indian cases of urbanization. And of course, the United States, China, and India are the three countries that have the largest urban populations globally. They all are seeing rates of urban growth, but for different reasons. We know in China it is wholly due to urban migration. In India, it's more a matter of natural population growth as well as rural to urban in migration. In the USA, it's a combination of different factors, including international migration, urban consolidation, and natural population growth. So cities are growing in our largest urban sites for different kinds of reasons, but there are real links between migration to cities and urban inequalities. And it picks up on this point about anti-growth, anti-urban growth agendas, often being anti-poor agendas. We want to stop poor people moving into cities. Now, historically speaking, those of us who have been concerned with urban inequalities have seen cities as unequal because they concentrate large numbers of poor populations. So in a sense, urban inequality was a problem of the poor. What we're seeing now, of course, in many rich world as well as many developing world cities is urban wealth driving patterns of inequality at the top end. So when we're thinking about migration and its relation to inequality in cities, we need to be thinking about this, of course, in terms of poorer populations moving into cities, seeking economic opportunities, leaving behind situations of conflict or environmental degradation, but also migration at the top end. And my take here may be particularly inflected by living in a city such as London. London's population is growing. It's growing very slowly compared to other centres of urban growth. It is almost wholly due to international migration. British people are moving out of London. The flows out of the city are more pronounced when you're looking at UK citizens. The growth of London is largely attributable to international immigration from the EU, of course, but also more broadly speaking. And those patterns of migration are occurring both in terms of low-income sectors and people who are moving into low-skill jobs, even if they may be fairly highly skilled workers in their own right and their original context, but also because of top-end migration of the rich going into financial centres such as London. And here is a kind of a little take on some of Glazer's most important recent work. We know that one of the reasons why inequality is increasing in cities, and this is true whether you talk about New York or London or you talk about Mumbai or Shanghai, because of certain segmentations in urban labour markets that see increasing returns to people working in particular ends of the skills sector. So people working in finance, in producer services, in legal services and so on are increasingly hoarding income opportunities in cities. There are increasing returns to property capital in all of these cities. And we see either a failure of middle class growth in low-income economies or the stagnation of middle-class incomes in rich world economies. The other side of this equation, the increasing return to high-skilled workers, are decreasing returns to lower-skilled workers, decreasing returns to labour. But the last part of the picture that I want to touch on briefly, and it's something that Edward Glaser also picked up on in the end of his talk, is the role of the state in this picture in terms of deepening and even driving income inequality through forms of restructuring in the more mature welfare states and situations of state withdrawal or simple state incapacity in the context of growing poor world cities. This brings me, I just wanted to summarize some of the recent work that Ed Glaser and his colleagues and others have undertaken in the world's richest economy, which demonstrates the way in which income inequality is deepening in rich world societies and presents a real threat to poor world societies. The takeaway from these points here is the Glaser study, you can correct me if I'm reporting this wrong, the Glaser study of 2008 shows increasing income inequality in nearly all, with the exception of one major US metropolitan area over those two census periods from 1980 through to 2000. And the reason why income inequality was seen to pull apart in these metropolitan contexts was because of the distributions of skill across urban economies in America and the fact that certain skill sectors were attracting real income premiums and others were seeing decreasing returns in terms of the wages that they were taking out of the labour market. One of the very interesting findings that comes out of Glaser's and his colleagues' work is that there is a disruption between higher levels of income and relatively more equal cities. So by 2000, it was no longer the case that the best off cities in the United States, such as San Francisco, as we saw in the Gini slide, were also relatively more equal than others. That relationship had been exploded by this emergent trend after the 1990s, in which we see, and I'm quoting from the Glaser study here, we see cities that were increasingly polarized around inner city poverty and hedge fund entrepreneurs. So increasing immiseration at the bottom end of the labor market and intensifying wealth at the top end of the economy. The reason why I wanted to bring the state back in to what I've presented as really a set of market effects so far is because the reasons for intensifying urban inequality get at one of the many paradoxes of cities. The urban paradox that emerges from the fact that many of the processes which are shaping cities today can be understood in terms of the operations of markets. And the opportunities that emerge in cities and also the inequalities that deepen in cities can in large part be read as market opportunities and market outcomes in labour markets and in land markets in particular. But the other side of the paradox, which I think the first presentation captured very well, is that cities remain socialized systems in very extensive ways. Socialized whether through state organization and provision of services, or socialized through community, collective, voluntary forms of self-organization and collective provision. And this relationship between cities on the one hand as very complex and very thick market systems with all of the benefits and all of the disbenefits that that entails, and cities on the other hand as extensively socialized systems of collective provision, of collective endeavor, of collective benefit, if not always of collective disbenefit. This relationship, this urban paradox, both shapes patterns of urban inequalities and offers possible solutions to them. So how sustainable is inequality in cities? Not very, I would suggest. Urban inequalities present real threats to the dynamism of cities, to the well-being of urban populations, and certainly to the tranquility of urban life in a number of different ways. Economic inequality is in part a normal effect of the operations of urban markets, but at a certain point, economic inequalities become barriers to market dynamism, in closing off opportunities to too many members of the urban population, often, of course, along very conventional lines. Economic opportunities being closed off, for example, along lines of gender in many cities, along lines of race or ethnicity, along lines of legal status in many migration cities. So this is an inefficiency for the operations of urban economies, when inequalities mean that large or significant proportions of the urban population have opportunities foreclosed to them for market entry, for education and training, the development of skills, for entrepreneurship, and so on. The kinds of inefficiencies that are associated with the fact that poorer populations in cities cannot live close to their places of work. The costs entailed just in a very everyday sense of lengthy commutes to work on underfunded and overcrowded public, private, and semi-private systems. Urban inequality is also a threat to environmental sustainability. We've heard about the kinds of ecologies of scale that return to cities in environmental terms, the capacity for density to create environmental economies in terms of consumption and emissions. But the other side of this is the way in which inequalities in cities are linked quite consistently with quite stark disparities, not only in consumptions and emissions profiles for different urban populations within the same cities, not just across a geography of rich and poor world cities, but also the very deep disparities that exist in terms of exposure to environmental harms within urban populations. That very perverse urban equation under which those who consume and emit the least in environmental terms tend to be those who are most exposed to environmental harms through pollution, through in terms of poor water quality, lack of sanitation, the risks posed by the privatized motor car, the private motor car, largely to those who don't drive them. And we can sort of read these, the nightlights model for reading the uneven geographies of environmental consumption and environmental harm, even within the same city. And finally, in terms of social sustainability, urban inequality is an urban ill in terms of its impact on social cohesion, on public safety, the costs involved in policing and securing deeply unequal cities. So urban inequality is a problem for urban dwellers. We see it occurring and being produced in some quite similar ways across international urban income divides. It's a problem for city governments. It's often a problem that is produced in part through the actions and the inactions of government, but it also presents an area of real governance potential. Dealing with the bads of urbanization is one of the primary tasks of metropolitan governments, But we should also note that city and national governments are also part of the problem, are often drivers of urban inequality. But the kinds of capacities that city governments will have differentially, unevenly, but not always at high cost in the fields of education, transport, policing and public safety, environment and open spaces, health and sanitation, planning and building, but also in terms of citizenship and social inclusion. These areas of urban governmental reach offer real opportunities for mitigating, responding to, and indeed, to an extent, preventing patterns of urban inequality. So to conclude, urban inequality is one of the things that cities do. As cities grow and extend through complex and thick market systems, inequalities in income, in outcomes, and in experience are likely to entail. So while the production of urban inequalities may be inevitable, I want to suggest to you that it's not ungovernable, and that this remains one of the key challenges for our increasingly urban world. Thank you.